Welcome to Sounding Board. Sounding Board is a production of Seroptimus International of Novato. Seroptimus is an organization for women whose mission is to better the lives of women and girls locally and globally. Hi, I'm Renee Roberts and I'll be your moderator this evening. Tonight's show focuses on the impact of the prison system on lives of women, youth, and their families, of incarcerated people, and the unjust conditions that people in prison face. I'd like to welcome my guests, Adrienne Skye Roberts and Dagmar Hesker. Adrienne is a community organizer, educator, and artist, and she is here to speak about the organization California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and also about the group called Fired Up, which is a group that goes into this county jail and meets with the women there. Dagmar Hesker is also a member of the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, and she is here to speak about her personal experience as a mother of a young woman who is incarcerated in the San Francisco County Jail. She'll also be talking about the juvenile justice system and those issues as well. Welcome to you both to Sounding Board. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adrienne, can you begin by telling us about the California Coalition for Women Prisoners?
Yes. The California Coalition for Women Prisoners, or CCWP as we call it, is a grassroots social justice organization that has members both inside and outside of prison. We do support and advocacy for women and transgender people currently incarcerated in the 3 California state prisons. And we also do campaign work and work on legislation in support of prisoners' rights. And we do all of this with a vision of ending the violence that is imposed on people's lives by the prison system.
And how did the organization begin?
The story of CCWP is really interesting and really inspirational. In 1995, women who were incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility, which is one of 2 prisons in Chowchilla, California, got together and under the leadership of one woman named Charisse Shoemate, they sued the then Governor Pete Wilson and also the California Department of Corrections, rightfully claiming that the healthcare in prison was so bad that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore was a violation of our 8th Amendment rights. So these women were suffering from life-threatening illnesses. Many had tuberculosis, hepatitis C, many more were HIV positive, and their illnesses were disregarded largely by the prison medical staff. They were given inadequate treatment, often just over-the-counter medication for severe pain. There were really long delays between their doctor's appointments, and they often saw doctors who had little to no experience with their conditions.
Well, what was the result of the lawsuit?
So the lawsuit was settled in 1997, and it was settled in favor of Charisse Shoemate and the prisoners, which was an amazing success. However, very few changes were actually made to the health care that the women were receiving, and the inadequate health care continues to be a major issue for women and all people in prison, and just an incredible violation of the human rights of people in prison. The sort of silver lining of the situation of the trial is that it's through this trial that CCWP was formed. So Charisse Shoemate and the women who were fighting for the right to adequate medical care inside the prison intentionally sought out the support and solidarity of people outside of prison. So it was through that trial that the catalyst for the California Coalition for Women Prisoners was born.
I see. And can you tell us a bit about the membership inside? What crimes are women most often incarcerated for?
Well, there's a variety of crimes, but many of our members and many of the women who we see through CCWP who were given long-term sentences are survivors of domestic violence. And are actually in prison for killing or injuring their abuser. And many of them were were tried at a time when the evidence of self-defense against domestic violence was actually not allowed in a courtroom. So it's kind of hard to imagine, but before 1996, any evidence of self-defense was considered not important to the case of a battered woman. So these women were, first abused by their partners or their family members, and then suffered the abuse of a system that denied this violent reality of their lives to be taken into consideration during their trial. Many of these women and many of the women who are members of CCWP are also mothers, and so they were the primary caretakers of their children at the time of their incarceration. So children are often then adopted or go into a foster care system and are isolated from their mothers. Many of our members in prison and also in the San Francisco County Jail Group, Fired Up, are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. So for drug sales, for drug possession, for theft, burglary, sex work, crimes that are considered crimes of survival, which basically means that someone is selling drugs or they are stealing items from a store because they have no other way to make money. They have no other way to take care of the very basic necessities for their life. And it's also important to mention that women are the largest, fastest growing sector of the prison population in the United States, and that women of color comprise of 2/3 of the population of women in prison.
Can you discuss how race and class affect the incarceration of women?
Yes. This is a big question, and it's a really important question. The disproportionate number of women of color, and particularly African American women in prison, is a result of institutional oppression of people of color and of poor people. And so I'm going to maybe describe what I mean by that and then give a few examples. Okay. So when we say institutional oppression or institutional racism, what we mean is that it's a system of inequality and injustice based on race and economic class that disenfranchises some people and privileges other people. So it's not just, we're not just talking about discrimination or racism that exists between people, two people, although that is also important. What we mean is these systems of inequality and injustice are perpetuated through institutions like the government, the legal system, the media. So some examples of this are the fact that many low-income neighborhoods that are home to predominantly people of color are cut off from local government resources. So oftentimes there are very few job employment opportunities in these neighborhoods. Public schools are often the first to close in these neighborhoods. There's often inadequate public transportation in these neighborhoods, a lack of access to healthy foods. And so rather than funneling resources into these neighborhoods in order to allow people to thrive and sustain themselves, it's these very neighborhoods that are most heavily policed and surveilled by law enforcement. Another example would be the issue of homelessness. So folks who have unstable housing are more likely to end up having to live on the streets. And when you live on the streets, you're more vulnerable to arrest. So rather than seeing homelessness as, a problem for us to try to solve as a community, people who don't have enough money to support themselves with a roof over their head, we criminalize homelessness and homeless people. And this is really important when thinking about women who make the decision to leave an abusive relationship, often with their kids in tow and without enough money to support themselves in a new home. And they are often in shelters, in resident hotels, or forced to live on the streets.
And what about once you are arrested?
So one's economic class plays a huge role once you are arrested in terms of the resources that you have access to. So this means whether or not you can make your bail, for example, or whether or not you can afford your own legal counsel. And once you are actually in jail or prison, each person in jail or prison is expected to or has to pay for their own personal items. So stationery, stamps, which means corresponding with your family members and your loved ones outside of jail, hygiene products. These are all things that one would not have access to without financial support. So the conditions of people's lives once they are actually arrested and held in jail or prison is incredibly negatively impacted by being poor.
Mm-hmm. And how exactly does CCWP help incarcerated women?
So we have a lot of different ways that we support people in prison. So I'll just mention a few here. CCWP has 6 visiting teams that are comprised of volunteers who travel down to the 3 California state prisons. 2 are in Chowchilla, which is in Central California, and the 3rd one is in Corona, which is near Los Angeles. And we make visits to these prisons about every 2 to 3 months. And we mostly see women who've been given life sentences. And this is the primary way that we support and advocate for these women. And we also do a lot of work around, trying to bring their experiences and their voices out to the general public because they're so isolated. So this idea of building and maintaining relationships that the prison system attempts to make impossible rather, is really at the heart of what CCWP does in those prison visits. And we also publish a newsletter that comes out about every season or so. 3 to 4 times a year is usually our goal. Sometimes it's 2 to 3 times a year. And that newsletter is called The Fire Inside. And it is a communication tool for people in prison to communicate with their supporters outside. It's also a way that we bring a lot of issues to the general public about incarceration. And many of our members inside prison write the content for the newsletter, and it's then distributed to hundreds of people, both inside and out of prison throughout the country. We also have started to work in San Francisco County Jail in a group called Fired Up, which you mentioned.
And what is Fired Up?
Well, Fired Up is a very exciting new project that is sort of a branch of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. It was started in September of 2011 by 2 formerly incarcerated women who are also CCWP members. And we hold a weekly self-empowerment group in a women's pod at the San Francisco County Jail. And together we talk with our members inside about all kinds of issues, mostly political issues, mostly issues related to incarceration, and social justice causes. It's really a space that we come together and try to give the women inside who are often left voiceless by the system a space to share their experiences with each other and to empower each other as women. A lot of our members inside the county jail are also mothers. A lot of us are lesbians, so there's a lot of conversation around women's rights and women's issues and gender. Another important part about Fired Up is that we do a lot of one-on-one support and advocacy for people inside of our group. So those of us who are coming into the county jail as outside members, because it's modeled in the same way that CCWP is in terms of inside and outside members. And those of us who come in as outside members act as legal advocates. So we are often contacting the lawyers or the case managers of the women in the group. And we are acting as a liaison oftentimes and attending court dates and just sort of providing as much support as we can to the women inside the county jail. And we do this in an effort to build a sort of long-term group in which these women, once they are released, will then come join us on the outside and support each other as formerly incarcerated people, and then turn around and support those who are still locked up in the county jail. And this is actually where I met Dagmar's daughter, Veronica, who has been a member of Fired Up since it began in September, and I've been working with her since November 2011.
Wow, great. Well, this is a good segue to my other guest, Dagmar. You're the mother of a young woman who's in the San Francisco County Jail. Can you tell us about your daughter?
Yes, my daughter Veronica got arrested in 2008, and there's no bail in juvenile court, so we were not able to bail her out. And it's also interesting to note that she was categorized as Latino, even so she is half white. And her dad is Latino, and I'm white, so she was categorized as Latino. And after a 3-day trial in juvenile court in 2009, the decision was made to put her into the adult system, into adult court. And a few days after her 18th birthday in juvenile hall, she was transported into adult jail. And her bail was set over $1 million.
Wow.
It makes it almost impossible for families to bail their loved ones out. And also we found out actually if in the event she should be convicted, she can receive a sentence of 25 years to life.
Wow. How has her ethnicity as Latina factor into her experience?
Well, actually, I found out the majority of juveniles who are sent into the adult system are actually of minority, with Hispanics the second biggest group of juveniles.
Well, it's hard to believe how your daughter spent 4 years in jail without coming to trial yet. How old is your daughter now?
21.
21. Well, Dagmar, I really appreciate you coming here to share Veronica's story. I want to ask you, how has her incarceration affected you, and what is your experience of a mother of having a daughter in jail?
Well, the biggest thing and the first thing I would like to say is that if somebody you love is locked up in jail, especially as a parent, part of you is locked up as well. And so whatever she experiences is almost like I experience it at the same level because I'm her parent and I love her so much. And there's an element of helplessness seeing your child getting arrested and held captive by the same system that previously has protected her. So it's very confusing and frightening. And it's been some years now, and I've seen her growing up in jail and how much she has matured. Even so, despite the fact what she has to face in jail on a day-to-day basis. And she's alienated from her family. They don't really understand the situation too much or on how to deal with it. And also, I would say she has missed out on a lot of socialization, peer socialization. She's supposed to have at her age, and she doesn't have that.
Yes.
And it's a very important part of her development.
What are the challenges of trying to maintain a mother-daughter relationship under these circumstances?
It is very difficult because there's a lack of privacy. There's no privacy between her and me. Mail is read, phone calls are listened to, and they are taped. Visiting is very hard. Before I go into the visiting, actually, I would like to really make sure that everyone knows there's no physical contact between my daughter and myself ever. The last time I was able to give her a hug was actually on her 18th birthday, a couple of days before she left juvenile hall, and that has been over 3 years ago. And there's absolutely no touching, which is very hard for a parent to do.
Yeah.
And visiting is very hard. We have to, I only can see her on the weekend or on holidays. I have to come early in the morning, stand in a long line, sign up for the visit, and then actually return a couple of hours later. I only get a 20-minute visit. I visit her about once a week for 20 minutes in a very crowded room. There are about 7 other inmates with their respective visitors in the room, and it gets so noisy and crowded sometimes you can't hear anything. And so we have to read our lips actually to be able to communicate.
Yes. What specific conditions do Veronica and other women have in jail?
Well, jails are not really designed to hold people, I would say, longer than about a year maximum. Now, she has been in there like a lot of other people for a couple of years already. And I would say it's also because of the overloaded court system that moves on very slowly. The average waiting time for males, for example, is 5 to 6 years. For women, it's about 4 to 5 years to wait for their trial. And like I mentioned before, the bails are set outrageously high. They make it really impossible for you to bail your loved ones out. That's why they're set so high. If they want to keep somebody in jail, they set them really, really high. And there's no way we can get her out and between now and her trial, actually, because she hasn't even been tried. And also there's very little opportunity in jail for education, for one thing. There's basically nothing. There's no education, no college courses, no vocational courses. There's nothing. They're really bored. They have nothing to do. The food is almost unedible. I have to put a lot of money on her books, so she's able to buy from commissary, which is very expensive, and it's junk food. It's chips, Coke, Snickers, and the like. It's very salty and fatty food, very non-nutritious. And I think the worst thing is probably no sunlight. She hasn't seen sunlight for all of those years. It's over 3 years now in the adult facility with no sunlight. And it has affected her eyes. Her eyes are continuously deteriorating because of the bad nutrition and the no sunlight. And on top of that, it took her over 6 months even to be able to get an appointment with a doctor to even check her eyesight.
Wow, wow. Boy, how has your relationship changed with Veronica during these past 4 years? She's 21 now, no longer a teenager.
Well, she has grown into a young woman now. And my role as a mother has changed. I'm more of a support person now to her, and I act as a mediator from her little small world from inside of jail to the outside jail. So I tell her constantly what's going on, so she stays in contact a little bit because she's so isolated in there. There's no TV in there. She has no TV, no form of finding out actually what's going on in real life. They're very isolated. So I'm trying to bridge that gap a little bit and inform her about a lot of things.
Right, yes. Well, I wanted to ask you both how you got involved with this kind of work. Dagmar, with Veronica's incarceration, that was probably a major factor, but were there other reasons? And then Adrienne, I'd like to ask you the same question, how you got involved with CCWP.
Yes, well, when I came to this country in 1987, the first thing, of course, I knew was that there's still capital punishment here. We don't have that in Germany, and it was very foreign to me, and even barbaric, that you still punish people here in the form of a death sentence. It's almost like treating them like animals and putting them to sleep. It's horrible. It's very incomprehensible to me that this is actually a legal form of punishment. It's absolutely barbaric to me.
Adrienne?
Well, I have less of a personal connection to this work, although it has become very personal to me. I'm someone with race and class privilege who was raised in Novato. I was also raised a feminist, and one of the reasons why I was most drawn to the work that CCWP does is because it's an organization based on a feminist politic, and part of what that means is that we care collectively for all of our members. So all of us are responsible for supporting and caring for each other on both sides of the prison walls. And that is a matriarchal way of organizing and of being together. in the world. And, you know, we live in a society that teaches us to fear people who are different than us. And society perpetuates these stereotypes about people based on fear. So CCWP's emphasis on building relationships across the prison walls really challenges this, and building relationships across racial differences, across economic differences. So for me to be an ally to incarcerated people is to speak back to a society and a system that attempts to keep us divided in order to keep us weak.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we're beginning to run out of time, and this is such a big topic. There's a lot to cover here. Can you briefly talk about Prop 21 and then maybe about the Supreme Court decision that was just handed down
Sure.
recently?
Yeah, so I'll just mention these two things briefly. One is that one of the most detrimental propositions or pieces of legislation to affect juvenile justice is Prop 21, which was passed by California voters in 2000. And what it does is it shifts the focus of the juvenile justice system away from prevention and rehabilitation towards incarceration and punishment. And it does really, really terrible things to young people's lives. One of which is that it allows prosecutors, rather than judges, to decide when to try a juvenile in juvenile court versus adult court. So more youth are being tried in adult court and giving adult sentences and sent to adult prisons. So they have fewer chances at rehabilitation, they have fewer chances at education, all of these really horrific, detrimental issues. Last month, the U.S. Supreme Court voted on a 5-4 vote to eliminate life without possibility of parole for juvenile offenders who were convicted of murder. So this is a success that happened just last month. And basically what it means is that no longer can a judge give a juvenile a life without possibility of parole for murder. And what life without possibility of parole means is that you have absolutely no chance to ever be released from prison. So it's essentially a death sentence for a juvenile. And it's a great success that the Supreme Court decided that way, and yet it's not a resting place.
Yes.
There's still much more work to be done.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry that we are just about out of time. This could be a whole nother show. I want to thank you both for being here and for telling your personal story. Dagmar, I wish you and Veronica a lot of luck. And Adrienne, thank you very much for bringing up these really important issues.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Seroptimus crew members for helping put this show on tonight, for Rick Tucker and Leon Johnson for all their help. This is Sounding Board. Thanks for watching.